Hi, Indy. Thank you so much for joining me for Lead Time Chats.
Hi, nice to see you again, Jean.
Yeah. So today we're going to talk about the topic of what it's like to be at a startup that's acquired by a big company like Google. And Indy, you were leading the client team for Bump when it was acquired by Google. And then that team turned out to grow into the very successful Google Photos team. So just to start us off with some context, what was that process of, transitioning from Bump to joining a much larger company like Google? What was that like
Yeah,
for you?
yeah. That was definitely a shock to the system a little bit. But yeah, I guess to begin with, I'll start with the acqui-hire process as an
Mhm.
engineer, rather than obviously founders have their own challenges as they're doing all of this.
Right.
I literally had like 1 or 2 days warning before I knew I had a
Oh,
Google
wow.
interview. So, and as everyone sort of a Google interview has this like aura around it, right? So I was a little worried, but got through that, and then we did a bunch of these interviews with a bunch of other companies as well. But yeah, in the end, Google brought us in, and we were acquired by a joint effort between the Android team and the Google Plus team at the time. Um,
So it
there's
wasn't like an
yeah,
individual interview. It was kind of like an interview to determine if they wanted to acquire the team.
right. So the way this worked was they were already doing the full like acqui-hire process in acquisition process in parallel, but they
Mhm.
still wanted to interview the engineers in the company to make sure they met the Google bar to join the company. So
Mm.
so it was a double, it was a twofold process in that way. So went through the normal Google interview process
Wow.
to join.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, and so this is a similar practice with all the other companies we talk to as well. So
Mhm.
yeah, so I guess yeah, then we ended up in this joint acquisition. Some people joined the camera team. Some of us joined Google Plus, and Google Plus at the time encompassed a bunch of things. Hangouts, the Google Plus network, social network on its own, and Photos, which was part of that. Um, and so yeah, that's sort of how we ended up there. And yeah, it was definitely super interesting. uh, that building we were in was so tight. They gave us these like 3-foot desks and with these giant monitors, so we were all pretty packed when we got there. So yeah, it was an interesting transition, and I felt like, and my peers who joined with me, that we really needed to kind of just like really dig in and understand this like whole other code base that we hadn't written, really quickly, and kind of start being productive. So yeah, that was definitely its own world.
Yeah, I can't imagine having 1 to 2 days heads up to prepare for a Google interview, and it sounds like many other interviews as well.
Yeah, well, so steadily we got better. We got practice again, right? Like as you know, with these things, practice makes perfect. So by the
Right.
time I did the later ones, I was like, okay, I got this. I know what, all the tech interviews in the Valley and everything, they're all the same, right? So
Right, right. It's like the brute force, and then you're like, oh, and then you do the end login, and then
right, exactly.
put it in a hash table. I
Yep.
think you interviewed me with a very similar question
Right.
many years ago. Cool. What were some of the like more surprising challenges that you or your coworkers at Bump faced in kind of adjusting to the larger company culture?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. First being, there was just this huge code base, right? So Google Plus uh, was this sort of thing that Google like really quickly built. And so one thing that was a little bit of a shock to us was, there's this like picture people have in their minds about like, oh, it's Google, all the engineering must be like perfect.
Yeah.
And then you realize, like actually, people are people. They have the same constraints between deadlines and the features they
Yeah.
have to build and everything. And you're gonna be living in a similar place where the code will be messy here and okay here and pretty good there, and you kind of have to navigate all of that. So that was definitely a surprise. It shouldn't have been, in hindsight, but it was definitely a surprise. And so that was definitely an adjustment. The other part was, early on, to be honest, we were in a very political situation when we got in, and it didn't feel very like settled for a while. So I think it took me a good sort of solid, and a bunch of us actually, just because there was a lot of like strategy changes happening at Google Plus and Photos and all that at the time. Like about a good 7 to 9 months before we were like, okay, now we're building Google Photos and that's what we're focused on. There was a lot of back and forth. There's a whole other podcast that Dave Lieb did where he describes a lot of the stuff he had to deal with that I less so had to deal with as an engineer at the time, to kind of get us to a place where we were actually focused on building the one product that we all wanted to. So
got it. Cool. I'll definitely dig it up and link to it in the show notes. I guess I don't know how true this is, but from an external perspective, looking in on Bump and Google Photos, I've always had the perception that it was a really successful acqui-hire. And by that, I mean, like, it seems like the team really stayed together. Like this really strong team stayed together, had incredible retention, and then went on to build a highly successful product. Whereas, some other acquisitions or acqui-hires, people kind of stay, or, Silicon Valley kind of, brought some visibility into the like rust and vest phenomenon. And like, so I guess, what do you think were the factors that made it all work in this like very unique way?
Yeah. I think, as with everybody, they actually, most people want a clear vision and a mission to go chase after. And I think what happens probably with a lot of acquisitions is they come in and they're in, as I said, the first few months, even for us, right? They're in this sort of situation where they don't know what they're actually supposed to be doing. And some people get jaded and leave, right? What worked out for us with a mix of luck and skill, right? Was that we ended up in a place where we were focused on building a new product. And that's what startup people love doing, right? We were like, let's go build something. And so once that kind of got settled about 9 or so months after the acquisition, then we knew what we had to do. So I was able to just hunker down. My team, we were all able to just focus in and just start building. And once we got into that mode, we were in our sweet spot, right? And then so that worked out for us.
I also have the impression that the Google Photos team was able to kind of like be a bit of a startup within a larger company and do things a little bit more quickly, or kind of with their own process. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's fairly true. There's no such thing as a startup within a big company, but we were kind of left alone for a bit, which was nice for us to be able to do it. And to be fair, it wasn't just us, right? It wasn't just like the Bump people that came in and built Google Photos, right? There was this huge, amazing team already there that had built lots of great technology that we could then sort of bring our, product and startup mindset to, and kind of marry those like great technology and this mindset to build this great new product, right?
Yeah.
So that's why that worked out.
How large was Bump when you all moved over to Google?
I think we were about 20-ish people, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's quite small. Yeah, I've always wondered about that. So I've never been at a company that I've never gone through the acquisition process, but it's always seemed like, you gather all these people who want to work at a, 10, 20, 30 person company. They want everything that comes with that. And then you acquire them and then put them in this large company and, have them have to follow all this bureaucracy and processes. And Yeah, I'm just super fascinated by this journey because it seems like a lot of times that doesn't go well. People are like, wow, this is exactly what I did not want. And this is why, which is
Yeah.
why I was in this startup to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of bureaucracy too, right? I mean, that isn't to say there wasn't, but I mean, I think Google did a pretty good job with, you know, Google's so big where they definitely have people who can kind of like just focus in their world and don't have to deal with everything else. And we were, at least in those first like pre-launch days, definitely in that place.
Mhm.
But yeah, we still had to do the whole code review process, and I remember having to convince people that we had to rebuild the product, and I had to convince lots of leads in different parts of the company that I didn't know I had to convince, to do all of
When
that.
you all joined, there was already
Yeah,
a code
so
base.
Google Photos used to exist as a feature within Google Plus. So there
Uh,
was a path, engineering path, where we could have gone down, where we just sort of like stripped out all the Google Plus stuff and just shipped Google Photos.
mhm.
But it was very clear to me that that was not a good idea for many reasons. And I think probably the most fundamental being Google Plus Photos was built with this assumption that you'd always be connected to the internet. And
Mm.
so it was sort of built with this web mindset. And having done a bunch of mobile since the iPhone launch and everything, I came in and my team came in. We're like, hey, like if we really want to build this, like especially on Android being the default Photos app, this Photos app that works really well and can show you your photos immediately and all of that, we have to build it with a very different architecture, and
Yeah.
that required a rewrite in a lot of ways. And so that was a hard thing to convince a lot of people. So yes, I definitely had to deal with that.
Yeah.
But I luckily I had, some people had my back, and I was able to convince some key people, and we were able to make that happen.
How did you, because I mean, coming in, you were relatively new and like, convincing people who have built that code base, like
Mhm.
how did you approach that, convincing
Yeah.
individuals?
So a good chunk of those people actually moved off. So as I
Okay.
said,
Very
that helped.
convenient.
The
Ex
first,
stakeholders.
yeah, yeah, but we were still part of the larger sort of Google Plus organization at the time, and there were definitely people there who kind of were very invested in the way things were built. Um, and so, yeah, I had to kind of explain what I did earlier, right? That the product we're trying to build has very different constraints, needs a different
Mhm.
architecture. And the other thing, some of these people were worried about, you're just throwing away all this code that we know works, right?
Mhm.
And so I had to sort of point out, like, look, we through various reasons, we had spent a few months in early 2014 sort of pulling out components, like just re-architecting the existing code a bit. And so I pointed out that we're actually using some of the libraries we've already pulled out. So they were happy to hear that, and
Mhm.
that we weren't like writing every single line from scratch. We were definitely reusing things that we knew worked.
Mhm.
But the fundamental architecture had to be different. And so we had to build that part.
Got it. Yeah, the dreaded like second system problem seems like you kind of made an argument that alleviated some of those concerns of
That's
like,
right.
oh, everyone just wants to do a rewrite all the time.
Right, exactly. And I remember one of these reviews, one of these senior people asked me, is like, hey, how are you, can you tell me that you're not going to come around 2 years from now and want to rewrite this again? And I was
Mhm.
like, look, to be honest, we never know what's going to happen in 2 years. But the way we're writing this code now is a lot more like library and component based than the giant monolith type thing we were
Yeah.
doing before. So hopefully we should have a lot more reusable things if there is a fundamental shift that requires us to rewrite. That hasn't happened, so we're good. Yeah.
if you could go back and do it all over again, what's something that you would do differently?
That's a good question. It's hard to answer. I always find it hard to answer questions like that, especially when things went well.
Hmm.
So I
Yeah.
think there's a certain things I want to be maybe a little more explicit about uh, in how I went about things, because I kind
Mm.
of did a bunch of stuff, but I wasn't sure I was doing it the right way, or at least I now have like principles that I can define this around. But back then
Mm.
I was just feeling it all out. Um, you know, I realized one of the things that I did well, that I would probably kind of focus on more and kind of call out more for myself, at least, was I did the things that don't scale type thing in the
Mm.
early days, right? And so that's sort of the one of the startup mantras, right? Is like do things that don't scale, because bigger organizations will always focus on scale. So in my case, I was the default assignee for all bugs coming into Google Photos from the internal Google-wide dog food. So Google's pretty big, so that means a lot of people were dog fooding the product. And the engineers are also very opinionated. So
Oh yeah.
these bugs that I was getting were, quite detailed. And so, but I read everything. I was the default assignee. I read everything. And so that way I felt like I knew exactly where the product was at, where the state of the code was, and how much more where we were with respect to the quality I wanted us to be. And I thought that actually worked out quite well. And it wasn't actually as much time as it sounds, even though there were definitely times where it was like 50 bugs a week or something, But
Hmm.
once you sort of start doing it a lot, you kind of get you build a mental model on how to deal with these things quickly, right? And so yeah, I think that worked well, and I think that's something that people don't often do. They try to
Yeah.
build a system for that right away, but I
Right.
wanted to make sure I kind of understood it all before we built any system for it.
Yeah, that kind of speaks to the successful acquisition of that like startup mindset and
Right.
incorporating that into building new products at Google.
Hmm.
It also strikes me as like, the number of people dog fooding a product at Google is probably like an official launch for most startups, right? Like a
Right.
successful startup launch. Um, and so like, I guess for launching Photos V1, obviously launching something at Google, even dog fooding, but obviously externally is vastly different from launching as a small startup, right? So
Yes.
what were some of the differences that were unexpected or just memorable?
Yeah. I remember just like a month or so before launch, one of these, uh, our lead TPM, who sort of owned kind of doing the Play Store process within Google, he came by and he's like, dude, you're screwed. And I was like, what? What do you mean? He's like, you're gonna have 20 million people the first day. This thing better be rock solid. And I was like, oh, I was like, so that was definitely, one of those things that I was just so heads down working and my team was just working. I didn't quite internalize that, yeah,
Yeah.
day one, this thing needs to be rock solid. And so, as with most product, once you launch, you have to kind of iterate a lot.
Mhm.
So we were definitely in the mode where, like, as soon as things launched, I was just on top of the bugs. I was like, I want to know exactly what's happening.
Mhm.
And so the first month, we released a few dot releases to just clean things up, because even with the massive Google dog food, the real world's different, right? So.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So that was definitely something that was challenging. The other thing was, this is more sort of like, because we were part of a larger company and all of that, and a larger team. There's a lot of people who wanted to know, like, hey, when is this thing going to launch? Like, when are you
Mhm.
going to be done? right? And that was definitely a high pressure situation, especially because I'd convinced everyone that we had to rewrite the thing and all that. Um, and so I did what you're kind of supposed to do, is sort of build sort of, the onion style, right? Build the middle, the core first, and so on and so forth. So that at any point, if anyone sort of above me was like, we just have to launch now, um, we would be, we wouldn't have all the bells and whistles and all the features we wanted, but we would be in a place where it was like feature complete to what we had built so far, right?
Yeah.
So I made sure we were always doing that. So I always had an answer, like, hey, when are we going to launch? And my answer, being all flippant, was like, we can launch now if you want.
We just won't have X, Y, and
we
Z.
just won't have these features. So exactly,
Right,
yeah. And so so that's how I went about it. That was definitely an expectation that was that's a little different when you're in a really small startup where everyone kind of understands where you are, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And that sounds both like a managing out challenge and a like getting everyone to build it in that way, kind
Right.
of like coordinating between those two and making
Yes.
sure they're in sync.
Exactly.
So, India, having been in both, really small startups and a large company like Google, what perspective would you share with engineers who maybe have only experienced one or the other?
Yeah. I think there's some things that people have said before that I'll just repeat. I think that because they do resonate with me, is in startups you do get to see a lot of lot of different things very quickly, right? So there is, you get to see your marketing and, like pushing to the Apple App Store and Play Store yourself, your feedback mechanisms, all of that. And so you have to wear all these hats. You have to go figure it all out because it's just, you don't have people. And I remember when I joined Google, like there was this whole QA organization. I was like, what? And those people actually ended up, all the QA people were really happy with me because I would like really appreciated that they were there.
You're like, I don't have to do this anymore.
Yeah, I'm like, I'm so happy. Please just take care of this, so yeah, that's obviously a big difference. There's a lot more chances to learn a lot of different things in a startup. I think with Google, with something like Google or a large company like that, they have their processes down and everything. So you're constrained a little bit from that, but you also get this wide range of people you can learn from as well, right? And so I think that definitely helps where these is like amazing, and especially I'm sure that's the case with most of these other large companies too, but I felt like I was surrounded by these amazing engineers, and there was a lot I learned from them. So that was great to be able to seek out such a wide range of people.
Yeah, I went the other way. Although when I joined Google, I knew nothing and was a new grad and was there for a year and a half. And then I joined Pulse. And I remember the first thing that was so surprising to me was like, I made changes to the Android code base. And then the next day we shipped them to the App Store and people were like, millions of people were using them. And I was like, I don't have to wait for a 2-week release cycle. Like coordinate with this other team. Like, it's out. It's there.
Yep. And then I became the person that had to tell people that you can't release right away. That was a weird shift over time, but.
Well, cool. Thank you, Indy, so much. I think this will be very interesting to people who haven't been through such an acquisition process, and just hearing the story of, transitioning to a larger company, and also the different challenges you faced building Photos V1.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you.